We've had a lot of conversations on the show about mining and energy, probably a bit skewed more towards the energy side of things. And there are a lot of discussions within Bitcoin with regards to this. I think we're all, as Bitcoiners, are united in the idea that Bitcoin and mining is good for the grids and can support things such as grid stabilization. But there is a clash around the energy mix and specifically with regards to perhaps climate change goals. So that means there's been a clash with regards to renewables. There's been a clash with regards to the e-waste from renewables, whether renewables have actually weakened the grids. And when you dig into it, often you can find both ends of the spectrum misleading information or skewed information. I'll just give you one example. There was a thing that I think it's Epstein's book. He talks about birds that are killed by turbines, which is obviously terrible, and nobody wants that. But when you actually do the research on how many birds die, it's a very small amount compared to the ones that just fly into windows or into cars or into buildings. But there is this skew of information. From your perspective, what do you see the role of renewables within the energy mix, and what's your kind of perspective on all of it?
I mean, to be very clear, I think climate change is real. Like, I was called a climate denier by one of the authors of the report,
Okay.
which is pretty funny.
Yeah. I think that's unambiguous now.
I think we have to do something about it. I think what happens in China and India matters a lot more than what we do in America, actually. If you look at the emissions of the West, Europe and America, they're falling. We're actually doing a pretty good job overall. What really matters is actually what China does. They're building like 50 coal-powered power plants right now, more than the rest of the world combined.
Right.
So like the fate of the planet is really a function of what the number one emissions emitting country is doing, which is China. And then it also matters about the emerging middle class in India and maybe Africa and Southeast Asia. It matters whether they're able to decarbonize. And that kind of gets lost in the debate a bit, is like Europe on the margin is not going to change things. And the US, maybe a little bit, but basically our emissions profile is coming down. Renewables are definitely key into the transition, but you can also overdo it and then score own goals, basically. So that's what happened. The demand for coal has like totally surged in Europe recently. They did lean it heavily into renewables, and arguably, at least in the short term, it hasn't been a huge success.
Do you blame renewables for that, or a reliance on an over-reliance on energy from Russia? Because that seems to be the primary issue. Because the transition to green energy has been pretty good in Europe. There were specific, I think Iceland is entirely renewable now. I think, is it Denmark? Denmark's been so successful, they're actually exporting renewable energy to other parts of Europe. It feels like the transition was fairly successful, but the main issue, there wasn't kind of a plan B for energy sovereignty in a scenario where we are now, which, credit to him, I think Donald Trump pointed out to Germany.
He did. I mean, you have to do it in a realistic way. Yeah. So I would argue their transition was unrealistic because the premise was cheap Russian gas will feed our industrial sector. And so the Germans turning off nuclear, the Greens, totally anti-nuclear in Germany. And Belgium just turned off a nuclear plant. That is the kind of stuff that's unforgivable, in my view, because yes, it's all well and good to build a lot of wind turbines and solar and stuff like that, even if, let's say Germany's not very good for wind or solar. But you have to do it in a realistic way. You have to have insurance. You have to have backup. And now they're going to take a step back. The emissions intensity of Europe is going to go up. So, and in this country, I think there have been enormous federal subsidies for wind and solar. And I think it is possible to overdo it because at a certain, the model of the grid generation is changing, where you have more intermittency, more weather reliance, as opposed to conventional generation, which is just very predictable. And you will run into trouble if you have too much intermittent generation without enough batteries, for instance. And it's sort of an open question as to whether we have enough even raw materials to build all those batteries.
Yeah.
And there's an open question, is our supply chain now way too dependent on China? So have we now surrendered our energy sovereignty? Initially, we were dependent on the Middle East for oil and things like that. Now, let's say we go super renewable, or now we just dependent on China.
Right.
So, I mean, I think you do have to decarbonize. That's actually the main thing that helped us decarbonize in the US over the last decade was natural gas, replacing coal generation with natural gas. And that's been a big success.